Welcome to Strength for Today's Pastor, conversations with current senior pastors and leaders which will strengthen and help you in your pastoral ministry. And now, here's your host, Bill Holdridge of Poimen Ministries.
Welcome to podcast number 56 of Strength for Today's Pastor, and it's my privilege to be with Pastor David Guzik, a pastor that really doesn't need an introduction, but for those of you that are not familiar with David Guzik, he is a longtime senior pastor, as well as an author, as well as the producer of an amazing commentary series, the Enduring Word Bible Commentary. And he also travels and speaks and ministers to pastors all over the world. And David, just welcome. Thanks for joining us on this podcast.
Thanks, Bill. You make me smile when you say I need no introduction, because I always think that the number of people in the world have absolutely no idea who I am far, far outstrips the number of people that, may have heard my name once or twice. And so
yeah,
I don't have any illusions about that, but I'm very happy to be on the program with you.
Okay. Yeah, you're welcome. I remember losing a softball game once in our church softball team, and one of the guys said, there are 1.3 billion Chinese that don't even know we played. So I guess it's perspective.
Exactly.
Well, you just got back recently from a week-long trip to Cuba, and boy, that's interesting. I had been under the impression that there was some religious freedom in Cuba, but to allow a pastors' conference openly was a little surprising to me. So what happened?
This is a misconception that a lot of people, including myself, have had about Cuba. This was my first trip to Cuba, but I was there serving with some guys, including a lot of guys from our kind of Calvary Chapel family. They've been ministering in Cuba for the last 30 years and having pastors' conferences for the last 30 years. They say a pretty dramatic change happened in 1990 after the Soviet Union fell and was no longer able to assist Cuban and especially the Cuba economy. They say when that happened, Christians really stepped up and were very helpful in society, both Christians in Cuba and outside of Cuba. There's been a fair measure of religious freedom for Christians. They don't have to meet in secret. They are limited, only certain denominational organizations are recognized and churches need to come under those existing umbrellas. But they don't have to meet underground. They can meet publicly. But of course, they really don't have freedom of speech to speak about the government or society or politics with freedom, but they can teach the word of God and proclaim God's word, and they do. I'd say the church in Cuba is very healthy. It's wonderful to see.
That reminds me of Pakistan, where I was years ago, and they said you cannot speak against the prophet, you cannot speak against Islam, you may not speak against the Quran. These are death penalty possibilities for you. And what it did for me is it just forced me into speaking about what's most important to me anyway, just speaking about Jesus,
That's right. So there's this wonderful purity about the church in Cuba. They are very serious about reaching out and reaching others with the gospel. It's just wonderful to see.
That's great. Well, we're going to be talking in this podcast about a message that you had delivered when you were pastoring at Calvary Chapel, Simi Valley. I don't know how many years ago was that about 10 years ago?
Wow, I was at Simi Valley. I left there in 2003. So we're talking about more than 15 years ago.
Okay. All right. Well, the title of the message that I have had and that we talked about was Moses Style and the Jesus Style. And obviously, for those within our tribe of Calvary Chapel, this is a very important subject, but also for those outside of the camp of Calvary Chapel, it's an interesting subject because it's a discussion of church leadership. And so why did you entitle it Moses Style, Jesus Style, whatever that title means? Where are we going in this discussion?
Well, when you talk about different forms and models of church government, it is a very important subject. It's important biblically. It's important practically. It's important on each church level because While believers can have different opinions about church government, every individual church has to have a conception of how they're going to be organized, how they're going to be governed. And you really can't have more than one operating at the same time. You're going to be one or the other. I suppose there are some levels of gradation in between them, but it's going to reflect what you believe in how you really practice church government. And the title Moses style or Jesus style really came from my conception where I found people dismissing the form of church government that we favor in our Calvary Chapel circle. They were dismissing it because of the term Moses model. Now, Moses model is a term that kind of came from Chuck Smith and some in the Calvary Chapel world themselves. But they just found it easy to dismiss the idea, it's the Moses model, it doesn't have anything to do with us. And what I endeavored to do in that message was really relying on some of the good research of some other people as well. I really wanted to go out and just establish the idea that, yes, you can call it the Moses model or the Moses style if you want, but it's not. We don't follow it because it was Moses's model or style. What you're really talking about is the kind of church government that you see with prominence in the New Testament and in the style of Jesus himself.
Okay, that's great. Good clarification. So that was a long time ago that you delivered that message. Since you delivered that message, you allowed the message to be transcribed, and so it's in PDF format, the whole message, word for word. So that's available, and we'll talk about how we can make that available for anybody who's interested in listening. I just thought it was an excellent treatment, David. I loved the article. I still do. I felt like and think that it was very well balanced. You were very honest. You weren't out and out dismissing other forms at all either, but you were clear that you preferred one specific form. I just thought it was very good. And so the Moses style. Okay, so let's get to that as we dive into this. As I read Exodus 18, I look at Moses and what Jethro, his father-in-law, encouraged Moses to do. I look at that as really sound. I think it's just great wisdom, to be to God for the people and to the people for God, and to teach them the things that they must do, and then to select able men that fear God and hate covetousness, that have capability to lead 10, 15, 100, 1,000 people, and set them up as the leadership structure. And then the very difficult people, or cases, brought to Moses, and all the rest of the cases can be brought to those that he has identified as leaders. That just sounds right to me. How could anyone argue with that?
Well, one of the ways they would argue with it, Bill, is, what the Moses structure there has is it has a clear, defined leader. And Moses didn't lead fundamentally by committee. There were elders of Israel. There were people around him. But Moses led as a man who was guided by God, and we believe with accountability, both from God and from the people of Israel. Moses led, but there was a clearly defined leader. And there are some people who don't want there to be a clearly defined leader. They want everything to be leadership by committee, or they want, some other structure, which, in my view, kind of pretends that there's not a leader. Now, it's so important for us to say that we're not talking about leadership without accountability. We're not talking about leadership that just does whatever it wants. But the concept of a clear leader who leads a group or organization is plain both in the Old Testament under Moses and many others, and it's also clear in the New Testament. So, to me, it's so self-evident. I kind of wonder why this is often dismissed as not even being a viable option for church government and organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and having discussions with pastors that are part of more of an elder-led church model, an Episcopal form of church government, I asked them, so is there someone who's really the chief of the chiefs in your tribe or in your group? And there always is. I mean, pretty much every group has someone that rises up above the others and says, and they tend to defer to him. So really, what's the difference in practical terms if that's the way it's working out?
Well, Bill, I think you put your finger on what I think is so important to point out. In any kind of organization, there always is a leader. It might be a good leader or a bad leader. It might be an authoritarian leader or a very appropriately gentle and wise leader. But leadership comes down to a person. And even if you have a committee of 8 people, when discussion is made, people are going to coalesce around one person or maybe a couple people, and one thing's going to come out prominently. That's just the nature of how things work. What really amuses me is when you have certain churches that are led by very prominent pastors, very, very gifted, accomplished, experienced men. And sometimes those very gifted, accomplished, experienced men will act as, when they get into a board meeting, they're just one of the guys. They don't have any other say than anybody else. And I mean, really, the idea is kind of laughable, because whether or not they intend to have it or not, it's right. They just have more authority in that room. And they can choose to use that authority in a godly way or an ungodly way, but there's no point in trying to deny that they have it.
Yeah. So you did this a lot of years ago, then, this message at Simi Valley, 16, 17 years ago, if not more. And now, things are a little different. We have younger men rising up into the senior pastor role, and they have different approaches to a lot of things in life than I did in my boomer generation. Would there be anything that you would change, or that you look back and you say, you know what, I'd like a do-over on that part of the message, or whatever? Or are there any adjustments that might be made, or practical words of encouragement to that issue of the collegial approach that more people are taking now?
I don't know if there's anything I change, because I believe I state these things in the message. I'd want to maybe give them slightly more emphasis. But Bill, I think one of the fundamental conceptions that we have is that the New Testament does not command any particular form of church government. And so I really believe this is something that we have some liberty before the Lord with. I have no problem with somebody who says that they prefer what's commonly termed as a plurality of elders, where nobody has any more say than anybody else, and the pastor himself may or may not even be part of that, elder board. If somebody wants to operate a church that way, I think the New Testament gives them permission to do so. What I do have strong disagreement with is people who act as if the pastoral leadership model is fundamentally unbiblical and that there's no biblical precedent for it. That idea I'll contest very strongly, because there is clear biblical precedent. Matter of fact, I would even say it's the dominant form of church government and organizational government in the New Testament and the Old Testament as well. So another thing I would say, though, is that if people are going to have a plurality form of, if they're going to lead by committee and all that, then I think they should be very honest about how the arrangement of it is. And if they do have somebody who is, frankly, first among equals, so to speak, they're the chairman of the board, and their voice has at least a little bit more say around the table, then just be honest about that. I think that there sometimes is people just aren't really forthcoming about how things really work on a board or a committee.
One of the things that I've always been apprehensive about the plurality of elders model is that if the first among equal guy that's on that board, the pastor, if he does something, says something, and I'm not talking about something unbiblical or immoral or unethical, but he does something that others of them don't like. He tweaks this program or influences this program in a way that they don't want him to do it. So they rise up and they create consensus against him and they vote him out. And so he's no longer their pastor. And now that group is the determining factor as to what that church is going to look like moving forward. And they're going to hire someone that agrees with their preconceived position. And I think that's a good recipe for a church dying over a period of time.
Yeah, I believe so. And I would say this as well. Sometimes people are very strong about talking about the benefits of elder rule or a plurality of elders' view, but they don't want to admit to the weaknesses of it. And listen, Bill, moving things through committee and such like that, especially minutia of a church government or how a church operates, man, it can be excruciating at times. And it can be a real barrier to simply going forward in ministry as the Lord would have us go forward. So I think we just need to be honest about the pluses and the minuses of the different forms of church government, and just prayerfully go forward in the way God will. But I know God has used the pastoral ministry model wonderfully, and I think He continues to use it wonderfully.
Well, I would imagine you would agree with this statement that if any form of church government is used, as long as everyone is filled with the Spirit and walking with the will of God in His Word, then any form of church government can potentially work fairly well.
Yes, Bill, you have put your finger on what to me is the whole issue. The New Testament, instead of minutely setting out structures and forms for how church government should be, what it does is it tells us about character of the leaders. And if you have leaders of strong character, of godly character, any form of church government can work. Some of them may work a little bit better, some of them may work a little bit worse. But really what the New Testament emphasizes is the character of the leader, not the structure of leadership.
Great point. So the character then is the New Testament determination. That's such an important thing. What does that have to do with how does the guy use the character test to identify leaders versus the giftedness test to identify leaders?
Wow, this is big, and it's something that I really had to learn in the earlier years of my ministry. There was a time when I suppose like a lot of guys, what really attracted me to certain leaders in my church, in my congregation, was their giftedness. The guy, wow, what an evangelist he is. Wow, what a great speaker he is. Wow, what a wonderful personality, charisma he has, that kind of thing. And I would often appoint people that had very evident gifts to some level of leadership or responsibility in the church. And I would often, certainly not always, but I would often be disappointed and hurt by how that turned out. And then it just really came to me as I studied God's word that really God doesn't talk about giftedness being much of a prerequisite for leadership or authority in the church at all. What it talks about is character. And I really determined that what I want to do is I really want to look for leaders who have character more than giftedness. God can bestow gifts and increase gifts and bless gifts as He pleases. But character is something that God really builds within a man over years. And that's why it's so much more important for us to look to cultivate character in potential leaders through discipleship, but then also really look for character when we are looking to appoint people to positions of leadership or authority.
I love that. I had that happen once in a church transition I was involved with. We needed more leaders for the transitional board that was going to help with the process, but I didn't have time to develop anybody, so I started asking around the church, who are the men that you would go to for counsel if you had an issue or a problem? Who are the men that you see as understanding, knowing the Bible well, that have good families, those kinds of questions. And the same list of guys kept surfacing. And so they were the ones that became part of the transitional board. And 3 years later, they're still serving as leaders in that church, which is pretty cool. But it was almost entirely a character-based decision-making process. It was amazing to me even to see how well that worked out.
Yeah, it is. And it's amazing to see what God does. And we kind of all have a tendency to be dazzled by people's gifts. But man, character, that's what God really looks for.
Mm-hmm. In your message all those years ago, you brought something out that I'd never thought of before, and in defense of the senior pastor-led church model. And you talked about the structure of the church in Ephesus and what was actually happening there. And I thought that was just a genius and biblical and honest approach to the scriptures. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, many people what they do is they take kind of our modern environment of church life and they read it back into the first century. And it just doesn't work that way at all. In first century Ephesus, especially as it's described in Acts chapter 19, that amazing season of God's work and real revival there in Ephesus and in the whole region, the churches just didn't have their own buildings. Now, it does mention that they met at the rented hall of Tyrannus, but I mean, even at the biggest, the rented hall of Tyrannus, you could envision it holding 100 or 200 people. The work in Ephesus was so broad and extensive that it says that it reached the whole region for Jesus Christ. So what you had in Ephesus, is a multiplication of house churches throughout the whole community. Now, I need to be careful when I talk about that, because today as well, there's a big, I think, romanticization of house churches as if it's the only model. I'll just say this about house churches, Bill, is that as soon as churches, historically speaking, I'm saying, as soon as churches were able to have their own church properties and buildings, they did. In the early church, they didn't have house churches because they thought they were more spiritual. It's because the only thing they could have. And especially when it's the only thing that churches can have, it's a wonderful arrangement. But when we see the Ephesian elders meeting with Paul in Miletus as he's on his way to Jerusalem, the elders of the church at Ephesus, when we see them gathered with Paul there, many people just think, oh, okay, this is the board of elders for a giant Ephesian church. And it's not that way at all. The church at Ephesus was scattered over probably 100 or more house churches through the community. And these elders of the church at Ephesus were likely house church leaders. They were what we would call pastors of house congregations. And so they're much more analogous to what we would think of as pastors than men who sat on a single board of elders in the modern conception. And again, it's just a common mistake. It's easy for us to do it, but we just kind of transfer our modern structures and arrangements back to the first century, even when there's no place to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, the text in chapter 20 of Acts clearly says that these elders, the presbyteroi, and the episkopoi, the bishops, they were one office, and then Paul tells them to shepherd the church of God, which means to pastor them. So all those terms get all jumbled up into one person, really, and so that's what they were, and that's what was so wonderful to see, that the structure element of the first century church in Ephesus. That just makes all kind of sense to me.
Yeah, so I think again, we take what we term as an elder today and read it back, and not realize that these men were really much more like pastors of smaller congregations spread all about. That meeting that Paul had with the Ephesian elders was much more like a little pastors' conference than it was an elders' meeting, if you want to put it that way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I know that there have been guys that have been part of our tribe of churches for years, and they step aside from their role as a senior pastor, or maybe they've never been a senior pastor before, and then a Baptist church down the street or an EV Free church down the street, whatever, is interested in they need a new pastor, so that guy applies, and so they become their next pastor with a different form of church government. And in some cases, it hasn't worked out well because of two things, I would think. One is the senior pastor is used to leading, and he feels somewhat that his hands are tied. And then secondly, that, like you said before, some people are uncomfortable with one guy being more in charge, and they didn't want to leave him that kind of responsibility. So what could you say to that guy? Maybe there's guys that are pastoring a church where it is a plurality of elders or some other modified form of church government, and they're just really struggling. They just are not able to get the leadership bandwidth or the leadership equity they need to do anything that matters for the kingdom.
Well, the first thing I would say is, before anybody goes into a situation like that, they really need to go into it with eyes wide open. They can't kid themselves about the difference of church leadership culture, where if they came from a culture where there was a fair amount of deference to the pastor's leadership, don't kid yourself. If you're going into a culture where that isn't the habit, it will be very, very different for you. Now, that's kind of too late to say to a guy who's already in that position. But I think what he has to do, if he's already in that position, is do the very best he can to, through demonstrating that he's worthy of trust, by showing that these people and the leadership team there can trust him to make decisions and to give direction to the church, and to ask them to trust him. But I will say this, where the leadership culture at a church is very deeply connected to the thought that it's their job to counterbalance the pastor. He just needs to recognize that as long as that mentality is there, it's just not going to get better. And this really is the philosophy at many churches. It's the job of the elders, or it's the job of the board, the deacons, whatever you want to call it, whatever leadership structure. Their job is to be the counterbalance to the pastor. And almost instinctively, their job is to doubt or to oppose anything that the pastor would suggest, because they're there to be a check on whatever he wants to do. And again, if that's deeply ingrained in a leadership culture, the pastor has to really reckon with that and realize it may not change, or it may not change for a long time.
Right. So patience is required, or else, you know what, I think I better cut my losses here and move to a place where I can lead.
Yes. Bill, you've probably seen this as well. It can take a long time and be a lot more work than anybody expects to change a leadership culture in a church. You can't expect it to happen fast, and you can't expect it to happen easy. It may be a thing where you just got to cut your losses and say, am I willing to put in 10 years of real frustration in this to slowly bring the church culture into another place? Because I'm not being hyperbolic when I say it may take 10 years of steady, focused action to truly change a church culture.
That's a good word, and a safe one, too. Well, there's another scenario, too, that probably you would address similarly, but I'll ask you anyway. The guy goes into another country or another region in our country, and he plants a church. And he's got in his mind a clear, strong senior pastor leadership model, and he wants to lead that way, but he wants to, be one with his leadership team at the same time. But he finds that people are resistant to it, and he doesn't know why. And you and I both know of a situation in a certain country where that happened to the founding pastor, and the way the people resisted him was by withholding their tithes. They just weren't going to give. And he had to dig deep and find out what the reason for the lack of tithing was, or giving. And that's what he found out. We reject this model that you have brought here to lead us. We don't want this style. So what would be your counsel to that kind of a church planter?
Well, my counsel, I don't know, we might give different counsel on this, Bill, but, having lived and served in ministry in Europe, I'm really struck at how different the church leadership environment is between Europe and America. And in Europe, they are extremely suspicious of pastoral leadership. They're suspicious of anybody who wants to take leadership. And so they are very slow to trust people who are leaders. I think if somebody is planting a church in Europe and they really believe in the pastoral leadership model, they have to be willing to build that model through a lot of trust and a demonstrated reliability over the years. And they may have to start with a more collegial structure of church government than they would prefer, but with the decided idea that they're going to move it towards a pastoral leadership model as they earn the trust of people there.
That's great.
But it's a different environment there, and I think you just have to reckon with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
People in America are more willing to accept the idea of leadership. And again, it's not just in churches, it's in culture as a whole than are people in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, part of the title of your message that you delivered that so many years ago, the Jesus style. So I'm thinking of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples in John 13, the night before he's crucified. And then he tells them, if I then, your Lord and Master have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. So how does that model, that example of Jesus, his life in us, how does that affect the way we lead, even if we are pastors of a senior pastor-led model church?
Isn't it wonderful to see, Bill? First of all, Jesus was a leader. You don't see Jesus just kind of, well, guys, whatever you want, that kind of thing with his disciples. Jesus was a leader, and he was a decisive leader, and he was a strong leader. But what gave him, if you want to say the credibility as a leader, was he really showed that his interest was leading for the benefit of the whole team, the whole community, not merely his own benefit. And he showed that through his servant's heart, through his sacrificial service, time and time again. And it was a real demonstration that, okay, here I am the leader here, but my leadership is not going to be focused upon exalting myself or promoting myself, but upon honoring God, glorifying him, and taking care of the people in our group and the mission God has given us to do.
I've always thought that if I ever had to say, guys, you need to know I'm the senior pastor around here, that I've already lost the battle.
Yes. It's really true, isn't it? Isn't it, Bill? Yeah. If you have to, keep reminding people that you're in authority, it's pretty much a slam dunk that you're not in authority. You don't have the credibility to be viewed that you are in authority.
Yeah. I think it's important. Maybe you disagree with this. I think it's important for senior pastors, lead pastors to realize that it's amazing that anybody wants to follow us for any reason at any time. And that was the Lord that did that. And then to trust the Lord specifically, since promotion doesn't come from the east or the west, it comes from the Lord, to trust the Lord to promote me in the hearts of the people as I serve them. He's the only one that can give me that street cred with the people.
Absolutely. And, nobody is fit to be in a position of authority until they really have it demonstrated in their life that they know what it is to be under authority. And sometimes people have never really experienced that. But, that was the other dimension of Jesus's leadership that was so important. He demonstrated with every fiber of his being that he was under the authority of God the Father. He said, I don't do anything except what the Father leads me to do. And because Jesus was truly a man under authority, that he could demonstrate to other people that he could, as was appropriate for him, to lead in an authoritative way. And that needs to come through in our own leadership, I think, loud and clear.
Oh, yeah. And that was so obvious in Jesus that that's what was happening. He was under the authority of the Father, that even a Gentile centurion recognized it. He knew that that's how Jesus was operating, and that was really the basis of him going to him to ask that his servant might be healed. It's an incredible story.
Yes, it is. And you're right. There is something remarkable about just how apparent that was. I mean, I don't see Jesus going around giving seminars on, leadership and structure, giving TED Talks, so to speak, around the Galilee area. I mean, of course, he would refer to these things from time to time, but more so, it was just evident in his life and in every fiber of his being.
Boy, we really need, as pastors, to be those kind of men that allow the Lord to work in us in such a way as that it's evident that he has called us to be and do what we're doing.
Yes. Boy, you can't get around that. Yeah. And that we are people who are truly submitted to the Lord. We remember what Paul said. He said, follow me as I follow Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. We don't expect any kind of loyalty or people to respect our leadership, except to the extent that we're doing it after the pattern and the heart of Jesus himself.
Mm-hmm. That's good stuff. Well, this message that you delivered in Calvary Simi Valley that has been transcribed, I know that at one time that message was available on in MP3 format on the enduringword.com website. Is it still there?
I think it is. I'm pretty sure that it would be under the, if people go to the media section and go to the audio messages, I'm pretty sure it's under the topics.
Okay. Do you know if the PDF file, the transcribed version, is on there? If it's not, I can send it to you. And what I'm building up to here, David, is to try to give this as a resource to the listeners.
Yeah, I would love to make it available as a resource. Bill, you send that to me, and we'll post it up on the same audio page as the message. And I'd love people to have access to the transcribed version of that as well.
Okay, good. And for those guys that have never been on the enduringword.com website, hang around there for a while and linger and learn and how it's a resource. So many men, including myself, I go to the commentary and go to different places to find resources and helps in Bible study. So it's a great resource, and I wanted to kind of give a commercial for that right now to you guys that aren't familiar with enduringword.com, the website of Pastor David Guzik. David, I want to give you a minute or two just to encourage senior pastors, encourage pastors of churches in their leadership and in anything that can strengthen them, that they might have a further strengthened church.
Well, the first thing is to really be serious about your own relationship with the Lord. We can't lead anybody where we haven't been. And so it's important for a pastor in their own walk with God to just kind of have a continuing, refreshing, renewing, a continual life stream of God's presence and blessing into their life, just by doing the normal Christian basics, reading our Bibles, praying, drawing close to God in worship and in personal devotion, praying with our wife or our family, making sure we do just those very basic Christian things. And that our Christian life is genuinely growing, that we're not just on a cruise control or thinking that we've arrived. So that's the one aspect. And the other aspect is to really be confident in the Lord in your leadership, not to feel like you're never going to make a mistake, because we all will from time to time, but just to really have that prayer of David. I believe it's in Psalm 139, where he says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. See if there be any wicked or anxious way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Just to say, Lord, just do a continual testing of my heart and give me the confidence that I have in you to lead this blessed congregation the way that you would want me to lead them. Having that kind of reliance on the Lord and the Lord speaking to our life will keep us from the danger of man-pleasing. The fear of man is a huge obstacle to effective leadership. And it's not that we don't care what people think or that, God forbid, we're out there to try to offend people or anything like that. But fundamentally, our focus is on pleasing the Lord and not pleasing everybody else, but doing what God wants us to do.
Very encouraging. And as usual, very balanced. And I thank you, David, for joining us again. It's been great to be with you.
Thank you, Bill. I really enjoy it. God bless you on the success of your podcast. It's wonderful to see it really being a benefit to so many in God's family.
Thank you, David. God bless you too. Pastors, it was great having David Guzik. Amen. So maybe you want to listen again, or maybe you want to dive into our growing archive of podcasts dealing with a myriad of subjects: pastoral transitions, church assessments, leadership development, sermon preparation, sermon delivery, lots of different subjects. Just go to poimanministries.com/podcast or go to any of the normal outlets for podcasts that are out there today. Until next time, look forward to being with you again.
Strength for Today's Pastor is sponsored by Poiman Ministries. You can find us at poimanministries.com. That's spelled Poimen ministries.com. If something in today's program prompts a question or comment, or if you have a topic idea for a future episode, just shoot us an email at strongerpastors@gmail.com. That's strongerpastors@gmail.com. May the Lord bless you as you serve Him, His pastors, and His church.